I don't know if y'all are familiar with the comic strip Frank and Ernest. It's one of my favorites, and one of my favorite strips from that collection. It's just one frame. And the setting is this high mountain peak. And on the top of the mountain is a holy man. He's got a long beard, and he's wearing monastic robes, and he's looking very holy. And in the bottom of the frame, it shows a man who looks sort of tired and haggard and worn out, presumably after having climbed up this mountain to see the holy man. And the only lines in the cartoon are spoken by this monk, this holy man, who says, "You want me to enlighten you about the futility of materialism and the illusion of the ego, huh? Well, what's in it for me?" In this morning's gospel lesson, we have James and John asking Jesus for a favor. They want to sit at his right hand and at his left hand in glory. And I think that when we hear this lesson, we tend to make the assumption that James and John are asking about heavenly glory, and that their hope is thoroughly good and holy. Because who wouldn't want to get a seat next to Jesus in glory, right? I know I do. And that's kind of our hope as Christians. We all want to sit next to Jesus in heaven. But what James and John are asking about was not as wholesome as we might suppose. See, we have to remember that what James and John and the other disciples and a lot of the first century Jews at that time in Palestine, what they expected from Jesus as the Messiah was that they thought he was going to restore the literal kingdom of Israel. He was supposed to usher in a new political regime that would overthrow the Roman military occupation of Palestine and reestablish the Jewish nation. So in essence, what James and John were doing was asking Jesus to give them the highest roles in the new power structure that they thought he was going to establish. They didn't want to be left out of the inner ruling circle. You know, they wanted to be the prime minister, chancellor of the exchequer, that sort of thing. So I guess you might say that James and John are approaching Jesus and saying, "It's great that you're teaching us about how blessed are the meek and blessed are the poor and all that stuff, but what's in it for us?" And if you recall from last week, Peter actually implies the same question when he makes the observation that he and the other disciples have left everything to follow Jesus. The implied question being that, what are we going to get out of this? And they were stuck on the idea that being followers of Jesus meant that they were going to benefit from it. And I think that if we are honest, we tend to get stuck on that idea too. Some Christians think that by believing in Jesus, you will be extra blessed. Or that being a Christian means that somehow God's favor shines more gracefully on your backyard. It's a common joke among clergy that pastors always get the best parking places when they don't seem to be in. I always wonder if I'm doing something wrong because there never seems to be parking. Anyway, the idea of this prosperity gospel, it's very widespread. You don't have to look very far to find it. And that prosperity gospel idea runs into deeper water. And it touches on an ever-present theme in the gospel. Power. I think that most of us here, most everyone in the world, in fact, most other Christians, would approach Jesus in the same way that John and James did. We want to have power over others. We want to be able to influence others so that we can get our way. And even if our way is altruistic and we want what's best for others, when we're challenged, because eventually we get challenged by other people, we're quick to desire the ability to cast aside all naysayers, to silence all doubters, and enforce our will at any cost. And I think that most of us, if given that kind of power, would very easily become tyrants who would lord it over others. But Jesus says this is not the way. The response that Jesus gives to James and to John and to Peter and to us is that while there is a reward for being his disciples, the reward does not come from our asking, what's in it for me? The reward comes from asking, how can I help others? How can I serve? The reward for being a disciple is not necessarily all that glamorous, and it certainly does not mean that we're always going to get our way. If anything, Jesus promises his disciples that by following him, they aren't going to get their way. The cup that Jesus drinks and the baptism with which Jesus is baptized means that the suffering and death that Jesus went through as a result of his faithfulness are available to us as well. And if you recall the scene from the Garden of Gethsemane, you'll remember that Jesus asked God to let this cup pass from me, if it is your will. So he wasn't too keen on having to go through what he had to go through. But if we're faithful disciples, we're probably going to find ourselves in situations that we might not have chosen for ourselves otherwise. But there's actually some good news in what Jesus is saying. And the good news, in part, is that we don't have to play the power game. Because I'm convinced that if all you care about is power over others, then no matter what side you're on, eventually you're going to wind up on the side of the oppressor. And to my mind, if the gospel is oppressive, then it's not the gospel. Another part of the good news is that we don't have to ask, what's in it for me? As if being faithful is only about what we get out of it. And if that were the case, then we could very easily make stewardship season about how supporting the church will mean you'll reap benefits from your giving, and we could turn the whole thing into a giant Ponzi scheme wrapped up in pious talk. Now, to be fair, I do think that it's fine to ask what's in it for me on a fairly small scale. You know, if I'm a disciple, I should expect that I could gather with my community in a safe and joyful place that gives me a sense of God's presence. If I'm a disciple, I should expect that my fellow disciples will do their best to help spread the good news. If I'm a disciple, I should expect my leaders to do a good job of explaining the Scripture and teaching the faith. So yes, there are things that we should get out of being followers of Jesus, but none of them involve becoming so important, so self-important, that we lose sight of who we are and what we're called to do. And we are called to serve. We're called to serve each other and to serve with each other. It's sort of like a marriage. If any of you who are married ever think that you are so important that you shouldn't have to mop the floor or take out the trash because that's your spouse's job, I'd be interested to know how that's working out for you. It's not to get tips, love. Marriage is more about mutual service than it is about what's in it for me. So if you find this morning's gospel lesson somewhat familiar, and if you've ever been tempted to approach Jesus solely out of a desire to get ahead in life, then first I want you to know that you are actually in good company. You know, James and John and some of the great saints of the church did the same thing. But I also hope you take away the lesson that Jesus teaches those same disciples and us as well. Greatness in God's kingdom is measured by how you use your gifts in the service of others. Amen.